here to call for an end to war and occupations around the world, an end to militarization of police and communities around the country, an end to gun violence, an end to white nationalism and racism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, sexism, homophobia, gender identity, oppression in our society. We call instead for the redirection of resources from the industries of violence to providing for the well-being of all people, everywhere, preservation of our endangered environment. As Bishop William Barber II and Reverend Dr. Liz Theophilus, the co-chairs of the Poor People's Campaign, warned in their February 25th statement, we're watching a war unfold with Russia's attack on Ukraine that has huge ramifications for the entire world, especially the poor. As always in the case of war and violence, poor and low-income people lose the most. In a war over geopolitics and oil, poor people become pawns as autocrats play dangerous and deadly games. This act of war is in part the result of a Christian nationalist project developed by Putin and supported by the likes of autocrats in this country. With the invoking of nuclear weapons, this reckless attack could lead to global disaster. The United States is the biggest military spender by far. It accounted for 39% of the global military spending, about 2.5 times as much as China and Russia combined. Military spending accounts for more than half of the federal budget. The March 9, 2022 bipartisan budget deal to fund the federal government for next year provides $730 billion in discretionary domestic spending versus $782 billion for the military and for war. The U.S. maintains huge numbers of military bases in 80 countries around the world. Even if the current crisis brings no wider war, the end of hostilities will bring a world much changed. The response from those who rule in all the most powerful states is likely to be more arms racing. A campaign for more arms spending and more military forces is already underway in the United States and Europe. This will only harden the confrontation between the governments of US and NATO, not only with Russia, but with China, increasing the risk of war among nuclear-armed countries. For decades, we have seen deepening inequality and injustice at home and intensifying confrontations abroad. Throwing more state violence at social and political problems has an unbroken record of failure. It's time to seek a different path. The Ukraine crisis reminds us that 90% of all nuclear warheads are owned by Russia and the United States. Over the next 30 years, we plan to spend more than $2 trillion on our nuclear arsenal, upgrading our nuclear bombs and warheads, the bombers, missiles, and submarines that deliver them.
Yet, before the pandemic, 140 million Americans were living in poverty or one emergency away from economic ruin. That's 43% of the nation and 52% of its children. 51% of people in California are poor or low income, a total of 20 million residents. This includes 62% of children, 54% of women, 61% of Black people, 71% of Latinx people, and 38% of white people. How can that be acceptable, given that the California economy is worth over $3 trillion, making it the 5th largest economy in the world? In his Beyond Vietnam speech, Dr. King declared, "A nation that continues year after year to spend more on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death." When Dr. King gave this speech, the United States was embroiled in the Vietnam War, and the country was in turmoil as peace activists resisted the draft, and anti-war and civil rights protesters took the streets. Dr. King's speech laid bare the relationship between U.S. wars abroad and the racism and poverty being challenged by the civil rights movement alone, and it was controversial in some parts of the civil rights movement.
I come to this magnificent house of worship tonight because my consciousness leaves me no other choice. A time comes when silence is betrayal. That time has come for us in relation to Vietnam. The truth of these words is beyond doubt, but the mission to which they call us is a more difficult one. Even when pressed by the demands of inner truth, people do not easily assume the task of opposing their government's policy, especially in times of war. Nor does the human spirit move without great difficulty against the apathy of conformists thought within one's own bosom and in the surrounding world. More, however, when the issues at hand seemed as perplexed as they often do in the case of this dreadful conflict, we are always on the verge of being memorized by uncertainty. But we must speak with all that humility that is appropriate to our limited vision. But we must speak, and we must rejoice as well. For surely this is the first time in our nation's history that a significant number of its religious leaders have chosen to move beyond the prophesying of smooth patriotism to the high ground of a firm dissent based on the mandates of consciousness and the reading of history.
Over the past 2 years, as I have moved to break the betrayal of my own silences and to speak from the burnings of my own heart, as I have called for radical departures from the destruction of Vietnam, many persons have questioned me about the wisdom of my path. Why are you speaking, Dr. King? Why are you joining the voices of dissent? Peace and civil rights don't mix, they say. Aren't you hurting the cause of your people, they ask? And when I hear them, though I often understand their source of concern, I am nevertheless greatly saddened, for such questions mean that the inquirers have not really known me, my commitment, or my calling. Indeed, their questions suggest that they do not know the world in which they live. I come to this platform tonight to make a passionate plea to my beloved nation. This speech is not addressed to Hanoi or to the National Liberation Front. It is not addressed to China or Russia, nor is it an attempt to overlook the ambiguity of the total situation and the need for a collective solution to the tragedy of Vietnam. Tonight, however, I wish not to speak with Hanoi, but rather to my fellow Americans who, with me, bear the greatest responsibility in ending a conflict that has exacted a heavy price on both continents.
I have 7 major reasons for bringing Vietnam into the field of my moral vision. There is at the outset a very obvious and almost facile connection between the war in Vietnam and the struggle I and others have been waging in America. A few years ago, there was a shining moment in that struggle. It seemed as if there was a real promise of hope for the poor, both black and white, through the poverty program. There were experiments, hopes, new beginnings. Then came the buildup in Vietnam, and I watched the program broken and eviscerated as if it were some idle political plaything of a society gone mad on war, and I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor so long its adventures like Vietnam continued to draw men and skills and money like some demonic destructive suction tube. As I increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and to attack it as such. The war was doing far more than devastating the hopes of the poor at home. It was sending their sons and their brothers and their husbands to fight and to die in extraordinarily high proportions relative to the rest of the population. We were taking the black young men who had been crippled by our society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Harlem. So we have been repeatedly faced with the cruel irony of watching Negro and white boys on TV screens as they kill and die together for a nation that has been unable to seat them together in the same schools. So we watched them in brutal solidarity, burning the huts of a poor village, but we realized that they would never live on the same block in Detroit. I could not be silent in the face of such cruel manipulation of the poor.
My third reason moves to an even deeper level of awareness, for it grows out of my experience in the ghettos of the North over the last 3 years. especially the last 3 summers. As I have walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men, I have told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems. I have tried to offer them my deepest compassion while maintaining my conviction that social change comes most meaningful through nonviolent action. But they asked, and rightfully so, what about Vietnam? They asked if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problems, to bring about the changes it wanted. Their questions hit home, and I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed and the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. For the sake of those boys, for the sake of this government, for the sake of hundreds of thousands trembling under the violence, I cannot be silent. In 1957, when a group of us formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, we chose as our motto, to save the soul of America. We were convinced that we could not limit our vision to certain rights for Black people, but instead affirmed the conviction that America would never be free or saved from itself unless the descendants of its slaves were loosed completely from the shackles they still wear. In a way where agreeing with Langston Hughes, that Black bard of Harlem, who had written earlier, "Oh yes, I say it in plain, America was never America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be." Now it should be incandescently clear that no one who has any concern for the integrity of life of America today can ignore the present war. If America's soul becomes totally poisoned, part of the autopsy must read Vietnam. It can never be saved so long as it destroys the deepest hopes of men the world over. So it is that those of us who are yet determined that America will be led down the path of protest and dissent, working for the health of our land.
I cannot forget that the Nobel Prize for Peace was also a commission to work harder than I'd ever worked before for the brotherhood of man. This is a calling that takes me beyond national allegiances, but even if it were not present, I would yet have to live with the meaning of my commitment to the ministry of Jesus Christ. To me, the relationship of this ministry to the making of peace is so obvious that I sometimes marvel at those who ask me why I am speaking against the war. Could it be that they do not know that the good news was meant for all men? For communist and capitalist? For their children and ours? For Black and for white? For revolutionary and conservative? Have they forgotten that my ministry is in obedience to the one who loved his enemies so fully that he died for them? What then can I say to the Viet Cong, or to Castro, or to Mao as a faithful minister of this one? Can I threaten them with death, or must I not share with them my life? Finally, as I tried to delineate for you and for myself the road that leads from Montgomery to this place, I would have offered all that was most valid if I simply said that I must be true to my conviction that I share with all people the calling to be a son of the living God. Beyond the calling of race or nation or creed is this vocation of sonship and brotherhood. And because I believe that God is deeply concerned, especially for God's suffering and helpless and outcast children, I come tonight to speak for them. This I believe to be the privilege and the burden of all of us who deem ourselves bound by allegiances and loyalties which are broader and deeper than nationalism, and which go beyond our nation's self-defined goals and positions. We are called to speak for the weak, for the voiceless, for victims of our nation, and for those it calls enemy. For no document or from human hands can make these humans any less our brothers.
At this point, we're skipping today a large section of the speech for the sake of time. A copy of the entire text and the original audio recording by Dr. King is available in many places online. Dr. King at this point gave a detailed history of the tragic role of America and France and others in Vietnam and the rest of Southeast Asia. He detailed our anti-communist obsession, our arrogant opposition to independence, democracy, land reform, self-determination. He laid out why we supported violent, corrupt autocrats and sought to restore a colonial status to Vietnam. He spoke with passion and empathy from the point of view of the civilians, the innocents, the villagers, the incredible horrors that they suffered. He described how their most cherished families were crushed and burned and blown up, eventually costing 2 million violent deaths and millions more persons devastated and traumatized. King retold the, quote, meaning of compassion and nonviolence when it helps us see the enemy's point of view, to hear his questions, to know his assessment of ourselves. For from his view, we may indeed see the basic weaknesses of our own condition. And if we are mature, we may learn and grow and profit from the wisdom of the brothers who are called the opposition.
While I have tried in these last few minutes to give a voice to the voiceless on Vietnam and understand the arguments of those who are called enemy, I'm as deeply concerned about our troops there as anything else. For it occurs to me that what we are submitting them to in Vietnam is not simply the brutalizing process that goes on in any war where enemies face each other and seek to destroy. We are adding cynicism to the process of death. For they must know after a short period there that none of the things we claim to be fighting for are really involved. Before long, they must know that their government has sent them into a struggle among Vietnamese. And the more sophisticated surely realize that we are on the side of the wealthy and the secure while we create hell for the poor. Somehow this madness must cease. We must stop now. I speak as a child of God and brother to the suffering poor of Vietnam. I speak for those whose land is being laid waste, whose homes are being destroyed, whose culture is being subverted. I speak for the poor of America who are paying the double price of smashed hopes at home and death and corruption in Vietnam. I speak as a citizen of the world, for the world as it stands aghast at the path we have taken. I speak as an American to the leaders of my own nation. The great initiative in this war is ours. The initiative to stop it must be ours. Excuse me. This is the message of the great Buddhist leaders of Vietnam. Recently, one of them wrote these words, and I quote, Each day the war goes on, the hatred increases in the heart of the Vietnamese and in the hearts of those of humanitarian instinct. The Americans are forcing even their friends into becoming their enemies. It is curious that the Americans, who calculate so carefully on the possibilities of military victory, do not realize that in the process, they are incurring deep psychological and political defeat. If we continue, there will be no doubt in my mind and the mind of the world that we have no honorable intentions in Vietnam. It will become clear that the minimal expectation is to occupy it as an American colony, and men will not refrain from thinking about our maximum hope is to goad China into a war so that we may bomb her nuclear installations. If we do not stop our war against the people of Vietnam immediately, the world will be left with no other alternative than to see this as some horribly clumsy and deadly game we have decided to play.
No, I'm 10 and Natalie is 11. The world now demands a maturity of America that we may not be able to achieve. It demands that we admit that we have been wrong from the beginning of our adventure in Vietnam, that we have been detrimental to the life of the Vietnamese people. In order to atone for our sins and errors in Vietnam, we should take the initiative to bring a halt to this tragic war, end all bombing in North and South Vietnam, declare a unilateral ceasefire in the hope that such actions will create the atmosphere for negotiation, take immediate steps to prevent other battlegrounds in Southeast Asia, realistically accept the fact that the National Liberation Front has substantial support in South Vietnam, and we must thereby play a role in any future Vietnam government. Set a date that we will remove all foreign troops from Vietnam. Grant asylum to any Vietnamese who fears for his life under a new regime. Make what reparations we can for the damage we have done.
Meanwhile, we in the churches and synagogues have a continuing task. While we urge our government to disengage itself from a disgraceful commitment, we must continue to raise our voices if our nation persists in its perverse ways in Vietnam. We must be prepared to match actions with words by seeking out every creative means of protest possible. As we counsel young men concerning military service, we must clarify for them our nation's role in Vietnam and challenge them with the alternative of conscientious objection. I would encourage all ministers of draft age to give up their ministerial exemptions and seek status as conscientious objectors. We are at the moment when our lives must be placed on the line if our nation is to survive its own folly. Every man of humane convictions must decide on the protest that best suits his convictions, but we must all protest. I wish to go on now to say something even more disturbing. The war in Vietnam is but a symptom of a far deeper malady within the American spirit. Guatemala, Peru, Thailand, Cambodia, Mozambique, South Africa, Venezuela. We will be marching for these and a dozen other names and attending rallies without end unless there is a significant and profound change in American life and policy. Such thoughts take us beyond Vietnam, but not beyond our calling as children of the living God. In 1957, a sensitive American official overseas said it seemed to him that our nation was on the wrong side of a world revolution. During the past 10 years, we have seen emerge a pattern of suppression, which now has justified the presence of U.S. military quote-unquote advisors in Venezuela. This need to maintain social stability for our investments accounts for the counter-revolutionary action of American forces in Guatemala. It is with such activity in mind that the words of the late John F. Kennedy come back to haunt us. 5 years ago, he said, quote, "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable," unquote. Increasingly by choice or by accident, this is the role our nation has taken. The role of those who make peaceful revolution impossible by refusing to give up the privileges and the pleasures that come from the immense profits of overseas investment.
I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. On the one hand, we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will only be an initial act. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho Road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. A true revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth. With righteous indignation, it will look across the seas and see individual capitalists of the West investing huge sums of money in Asia, Africa, and South America, only to take the profits out with no concern for the social betterment of the countries, and say, this is not just. It will look at our alliance with the landed gentry of Latin America and say, this is not just. The Western arrogance of feeling that it has everything to teach others and nothing to learn from them is not just. A true revolution of values will lay hands on the world order and say of war, this way of settling differences is not just. This business of burning human beings with napalm, of filling our nation's homes with orphans and widows, of injecting poisonous drugs of hate into veins of people normally humane, of sending men home from dark and bloody battlefields, physically handicapped and psychologically deranged, cannot be reconciled with wisdom, justice, and love. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. America, the richest and most powerful nation in the world, can well lead the way in this revolution of values. There is nothing except a tragic death wish to prevent us from reordering our priorities so that the pursuit of peace will take precedence over the pursuit of war.
This kind of positive revolution of values is our best defense against communism. War is not the answer. We must not engage in negative anti-communism, but rather in a positive thrust for democracy, realizing that our greatest defense against communism is to take offensive action in behalf of justice. We must, with positive action, seek to remove those conditions of poverty, insecurity, and injustice, which are the fertile soil in which the seed of communism grows and develops. The people are important. These are revolutionary times. All over the globe, men are revolting against old systems of exploitation and oppression. And out of the wombs of a frail world, new systems of justice and equality are being born. The shirtless and the barefoot people of the land are rising up as never before. The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light. We in the West must support these revolutions. It is a sad fact that because of comfort, complacency, a morbid fear of communism, and our proneness to adjust to injustice, the Western worlds that initiated so much of the revolutionary spirit of the modern world have now become the arch anti-revolutionaries. Our only hope today lies in our ability to recapture the revolutionary spirit and go out into a sometimes hostile world, declaring that there is equal hostility to poverty, racism, and to military buildup. With this powerful commitment, we shall speed the day when, quote, every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain and hill shall be made low, and the crooked shall be made straight, and the rough places plain, end of quote.
This calls for a worldwide fellowship, one that lifts neighborly concern beyond one's tribe, race, class, and nation, is in reality a call for an all-embracing and unconditional love for all people. When I speak of love, I am not speaking of some sentimental and weak response. I am speaking of that force which all the great religions have seen as the supreme unifying principle of life. Love is somehow the key that unlocks the door, which leads to ultimate reality. This Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist belief about ultimate reality is beautifully summed up in the first Gospel of St. John. Let us love one another, for love is God, and everyone that loveth is born of God and knoweth God. Those that loveth not knoweth not God. God is love. If we love one another, God dwelleth in us, and God's love is perfected in us. Close quote. We can no longer afford to worship the God of hate or bow before the altar of retaliation. The oceans of history are made turbulent by the ever-rising tides of hate. History is cluttered with the wreckage of nations and individuals that pursued this self-defeating path of hate. As historian Arnold Toynbee says, love is the ultimate force that makes for the saving choice of good and evil, against the damning choice of death and evil. We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. Over the bleached bones and jumbled residue of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic words, too late. Still, we have a choice today: non-violent coexistence or violent co-annihilation.
If we do not act, we surely be dragged down the long and dark, shameful corridors of times, reserved for those who possess power without compassion, might without mortality, strength without sight. Now let us rededicate ourselves to the long and bitter but beautiful struggle for a new world. This is the calling of the children of God, and the people wait eagerly for our response. Shall we say the odds are too great? Shall we tell them the struggle is too hard? Or will there be another message of longing, of hope, of solidarity with their yearnings, of commitment to their cause, whatever the cost? The choice is ours, and though we might prefer it otherwise, we must choose in this crucial moment of human history. If we will only make the right choice, we will be able to transform this pending cosmic elegy into a creative psalm of peace. If we make the right choice, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our world into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. If we will but make the right choice, we will be able to speed up the day. All over America and all over the world, when justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream.
That concludes this oral reading. This church will sponsor an adult education class about the Poor People's Campaign coming up. A bus sponsored with our help will be going to a rally in May on a Monday. People will be gathering in Washington, D.C. in mid-June. And the purpose of all of this is to as Dr. King did, to speak out against the interlocking injustices of systematic racism, systemic poverty, environmental devastation, militarism in the war economy, and a distorted moral narrative of Christian nationalism, making them into one moral fusion campaign, as Dr. King did in this speech so many years ago. Thank you for attending. So be it.